The sonograms didn't reveal any complications in his mother's pregnancy, and yet when Nick Vujicic was born in 1982 in a hospital in Australia, he was born without any arms or legs. As you can imagine, this was a huge shock to their family. Nick's childhood was a tough one, filled with loneliness and depression. At just 8 years old, he tried to take his life in a bathtub that was filled with just 4 inches of water. And his parents constantly encouraged him. Out of Psalm 139 that says, "You are fearfully and wonderfully made. Don't let the enemy tell you anything otherwise." And then at 15 years old, Nick gave his heart to Jesus. After hearing the story from John chapter 9 where Jesus healed the blind man, Nick said, "If Jesus has a plan for his life, I know he has one for mine." And his entire perspective began to change. Instead of saying to God, "Why me?" he started praying, "Use me." And at 19, he delivered his first speech at a speaking engagement. And ever since then, he's inspired millions of people through his positive outlook on life and his faith in God. He doesn't call himself a motivational speaker. He just says, "I'm a man of faith with a message." In 2005, Nick Vujicic started his nonprofit ministry. It's called Life Without Limbs, where he's been able to take the gospel message into schools and corporate events and even prisons. And thousands of people have responded to the good news of Jesus Christ. Nick is an author. He's a musician. In his spare time, he enjoys fishing, painting, and swimming. Did I mention he doesn't have any arms or legs? Nick has an incredible attitude. I got a chance to hear him speak just a couple of years ago. He's a funny guy. In fact, every time he speaks with a smile, he says, "I keep a pair of shoes in my closet just because you never know when God might do a miracle." Today, we continue our Made New series. And we're going to be diving into some of the thought patterns that we have in our lives that hold us back from everything that God has for us, from living that John 10:10 life that Jesus came to give us. Last week, we kicked the series off looking at Romans 12, verse 2. If you missed the message last week, you can catch up on our brand new podcast. We just launched that, and so if you're a podcaster kind of person, you can go and subscribe to that and get all of the Sunday talks on there. But we came out of Romans 12, verse 2 last week. And that's a verse that says this: "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds." You see, God cares about your minds. He cares about your thoughts, the way that you think, because in the scriptures, we see that it's with our minds that we honor God and love him. And in Matthew, Jesus said, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength." So it's even a way that we're called to worship God is with our minds. Listen, digital marketing experts, they estimate that the average person in America will see between 4,000 and 10,000 advertisements every day. So we're constantly bombarded with messages and companies telling us who we need to be, what we're missing in life, and how we can find fulfillment and satisfaction. And if that wasn't enough, then we pull out our smartphones and get on social media, and that's when we start to play this comparison game. We look at the highlight reel of our friends' lives and of lives of people that we don't even know, and we start to think, man, life isn't the adventure that it should be. But here's what I want you to write down if you're taking notes this morning. We hear this phrase often, but it's actually not true. Perception is not reality. See, there's a difference between perception and perspective. Perception is the way that we understand or interpret things that happen in our lives, places and people, wherever we go. That's our perception. It's the way that we interpret it. But perspective is our point of view. It's the mindset that we have in any situation. And you can always make a choice to have a different perspective or a different mindset by setting your heart on the things of God. Now, if you're in Isaiah 55, here we go. We're going to have it on the screens. Verses 8 and 9, it says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declare the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." Yeah, it's no surprise that God's thoughts and ways are higher than ours. I mean, he is God. But here's the deal. When we submit to the lordship of Jesus Christ, we're actually called to raise our level of thinking, our standard, our mindset. Here's what Paul wrote to the early church in Colossians 3, verse 2. He says, "Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. Now, in the original Greek context, the word for set your minds is one word, it's phroneti, and it means to direct your thoughts. Direct your thoughts. See, it's closely related to your attitude. And Paul is telling the early church, don't be fixated on the things that this world around you is obsessed with. A title, power, position, money. He says, but set your thoughts towards heaven's perspective. Tune your minds a little bit to the things of the Spirit and the ways of Jesus. Loving God, loving people, and living your faith out loud. It's having a different attitude. Being made new is about taking on a new mindset. We've got to understand that God has a 30,000-foot view on life. He exists outside of our limitations of time and space. He sees all. He knows all, just like it says in Isaiah 55. And when you put your trust and your faith in His hands, it allows you to have a little bit of a different mindset. I don't know if it's just me, but we tend to focus on right here and right now. Like whatever problem I'm currently facing, that's everything. Back in 2004, I auditioned for American Idol. My brother dared me to try out, and so I did that, and I ended up making it pretty far onto the show. Please don't YouTube it. You will not find any episodes. Pastor Caleb, don't give him that link. But I ended up making it pretty far onto the show, and this is back in the OG days of American Idol, okay? So you go on the show, and then at the end of Hollywood Week, they split up the group into 4 rooms. 2 of the rooms make it, and 2 of the rooms, your journey ends here. Guess what room I was in? Yeah, I was in the room that they let go. And I was completely devastated. I remember calling my dad in the hotel that night, and I said, Dad, it's it. 23-year-old Kurtis, my life is over. I blew it. I wasted my big opportunity. And my dad told me something that I've never forgot all these years later. He said, let me give you a little bit of perspective. If this isn't what God has for you, just imagine what He does. We said this last week. If you have breath in your lungs, you're alive, you're here, your best chapter is still ahead. Because God's story in your life never moves backwards. It only goes forward, and He always leads to more. And so my dad gave me that bit of encouragement, and it changed my viewpoint. I went back to Roanoke, Virginia with a little bit of a drive and a determination. Whatever it was, God, that you have next for my life, I am ready for it. And I often wonder this. If I would have continued in that path in Hollywood, would I have become a campus pastor, a worship leader? Would I have planted a church in Nashville, Tennessee? I don't know. Now, here's the deal. God saw all of that in a single moment. And when all that I could hear was your journey ends now, God was saying, no, your story is just getting started. You see, Abraham in the Old Testament wrestled with a little bit of that same mentality. Let me set the stage for you here. Abraham comes out of a land that does not know God. Ur of the Chaldeans is his kind of ancestry. There's no God there. And so he comes out, and he's the father of our faith, as he's often referred to. And so he's kind of the first dude stepping into this new thing, following Yahweh, which is the Hebrew name for God. And he gets this promise from the Lord that you will be a blessing to many nations. Through your offspring, everyone will be blessed. But he's almost 100 years old. His wife is a few years younger than him, but she's no spring chicken. And here's the deal. He says, I don't have an heir. I don't have an offspring. So how is this blessing going to happen? All that Abraham could see was the problem and not the promise. He needed a change of perspective. Here's what it says in Genesis 15, verses 1 through 6. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram. He was called Abram before Abraham, and that's another story for another time. But God will often change your identity when He gets a hold of you. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? And the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, you have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. Then the word of the Lord came to him. This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. He took him outside and said, look at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. And I love this. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. See, God had to get Abram out of his tent, out of his small, narrow mindset of thinking. He gets him outside and he says, look up. Look at the stars and count them if you can. This is my perspective. And of course, Abram can't even begin to number the stars. And I wonder if in the future, every time he went camping and he looked up at the night sky, he had a little flashback to this conversation with God where he realigns his perspective and says, hey, you were kind of in this small mindset, but I had to get you outside. Sometimes you have to physically move from one place to another to get a new perspective. Mark Batterson will say this, a change of pace plus a change of place equals a change of perspective. We need a bigger perspective in life. A couple summers ago, I had the chance to go to Uganda on a music-based mission trip. And on our flight over there, we had a quick 24 layover in Dubai, one of the most elaborate cities in the world. And where did we decide to go as a team? The mall. Hey, listen, if you are ever in Dubai, I highly encourage going to the mall because it is not your normal shopping mall. It is massive. And right there, as we're walking around checking out the stores, in the middle of this shopping mall is a ginormous shark tank. I think we've got a picture of it. And so I'm walking in the mall, and I come across this shark tank. It's at least 100 feet high, at least 50 feet wide, and I'm just standing there in complete amazement. And then a buddy of mine says, Kurtis, you're missing it. Come over here. So I walk around the side, and here's the actual size of the tank. 4 stories tall. I don't know how many gallons are in there, but surely it's enough to make some damage in that mall if there was ever a little hole poked in it. But here's the deal. I was on one side just seeing a glimpse of it when all I had to do was walk around and my entire perspective changed. You guys following me this morning? And that's not one of the only things that God taught me perspective-wise on that trip. When we got to Uganda, we visited Watoto. It's an orphanage just outside of Kampala, and we got to spend 10 days with some of the most amazing kids on the planet. They were orphans, made orphans by war or disease, and yet these are some of the happiest kids I've ever met in my life. So grateful for everything they have, and it's not much by our standards in America. And we were teaching them songwriting and production, and I remember one kid, he came up and he had this 2x4 board where he had literally drawn on a keyboard. He said, I can't afford an actual keyboard to practice on, so I've been practicing on this, and he's got splinters in his fingers. I said, man, if we could just get that type of perspective, that type of gratitude, God, would you change us? Listen, if you want to get a new perspective, I believe that one way God gives that to us is through mission trips. We're going to be going to Guatemala this summer. We're going to be working with some kids doing a soccer camp. And if you want to find out a little bit more about that, next Sunday, right after service, we're going to have an info session. We're going to tell you how you can be a part of that trip, what it takes, and what it's all about. It's going to happen late July, early August. If you want a new perspective on life, Global Missions is a way that you can get that. You go and you do some stuff, and it's pretty cool stuff that you get to do. But what you come back with, that's the stuff that changes lives. See, I believe it's a perspective of gratitude that even gives us a deeper trust for God. Gives us that Colossians 3 type of mindset. Part of being made new is a new outlook. And if you see everything as a blessing, you're much less likely to get caught in that cycle of comparison. You're much less likely to see that the world has way more to offer than what God's already given to you. Gratitude is actually a part of God's will for your life. 1 Thessalonians 5, 16 to 18. Rejoice always, pray continually, give thanks in all circumstances, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus. I have many conversations as what is God's will for my life? There it is. Rejoice always, pray continuously, and give thanks in all circumstances. We cannot miss the power of gratitude today. Thanksgiving actually catapults you into the very presence of God. Psalm 100 verse 4 says, enter his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise. Give thanks to him and praise his name. Thank you is the password to the front door of God's presence. So live life thanking God for who he is and what he's done. In his book, Double Blessing, Mark Batterson shares this idea from the Talmud. Now, the Talmud is the Jewish commentary on the Old Testament. And it has this idea that says, a man embezzles from God when he makes use of this world without uttering a blessing. In other words, whatever God's given you, if you don't thank him for it, it's as if you stole it. There's a belief that an Orthodox Jew would, in a day, pronounce 100 blessings from sunup to sundown. See, blessing is another way of saying thank you. That's why we call the prayer at the beginning of a meal a blessing, because we're thanking God for the provision of food. Whenever you bless somebody, whether it's with a gift, a meal, your time, or your money, it's a way of appreciating God for what he's given to you and what he's done in your life. And it's a perspective shift. Gratitude literally shifts our thinking off of what we don't have or how we don't measure up to what we do have and the affirmation that we've already been given through Christ Jesus. Thanksgiving highlights the blessings that you have in life, and it does so in any situation. In her book, The Hiding Place, Corrie ten Boom shares her story of hiding Jews during World War II, being arrested, entering into Nazi prison camps, and losing those that were closest to her. She comes out on the other side of this horrific story with one of the most powerful testimonies and ministries in the 20th century. In Corrie's time at Ravensbrück, one of the most hostile Nazi death camps, Corrie and her sister Betsy were placed in a flea-infested, disease-ridden, putrid dorm room that housed 1,400 prisoners. It was built for 400. When they got to this prison at first, the fleas were almost too much to bear. And yet Betsy reminded her younger sister Corrie, hey, thank God in every situation. 1 Thessalonians 5:16. And Corrie said, I cannot thank God for this situation. I cannot thank him for the fleas. And yet over time, I think the big sister had a little bit more to say about it. So Corrie turns to God in thanksgiving. Each night, after a long day of torturous work and ridicule, women in the dorm would gather around Corrie and Betsy every single night as they shared Bible passages, they sang hymns, and they led out in prayers. The Nazi patrol would check every room to make sure that the women weren't up to anything suspicious. Every room except Corrie and Betsy's room, where they held their nighttime services. A few months later, when Betsy was assigned to sewing duty, she learned why the Nazis never came into their room. It was the fleas. Every one of us has something to be grateful for. Gratitude gives us a perspective of finding good in everything. Instead of seeing what went wrong in your day, thank God for what went right. It's a perspective shift. I was recently watching an interview with Duke's free throw coach. Now, I'm not a huge Duke fan. I'm a Virginia Tech Hokie, but I respect one of the most winning programs in the history of sports. And this coach was saying that he shows his players footage of them making free throws. Now, most coaches in NCAA sports will show their players footage of where they went wrong so they can adjust it and make moves. But this coach had a different perspective. He said, if I can show my players how they make their shots and how they do it right, they're just going to keep doing that. And it's hard to argue because Duke has produced some of the best free throw shooters into the NBA. You can focus on the negative or you can see the positive. This is not the power of positivity. This is a perspective shift of thanksgiving and gratitude. In a 2009 study by the National Institutes of Health, researchers examined blood flow in subjects as they expressed gratitude. Their research showed that those subjects who expressed gratitude had higher levels of activity in their hypothalamus. Now, the hypothalamus directly influences our metabolism and our stress levels. The neuroscience behind Thanksgiving showed that gratitude leads to better sleep, lower stress, increased exercise, fewer aches and pains, and less depression and anxiety. It's all about the lens at which you view life through and everything that comes with it. And here's my point, or maybe here's my point of view. For those of us who follow Christ, everything that we see is in the shadow of the cross. It's through the lens of the goodness of God. Any problem or challenge that comes our way is just another opportunity for God to show off his power and his grace in our lives. There was a massive perspective shift that had to happen for the disciples from Good Friday to Easter Sunday. They're there seeing the man that they walked 3 years with, who claimed to be salvation, Messiah, Savior, and he's hanging on a wooden cross. Can't imagine how they were feeling in that moment. Defeat, failure. But in 3 days' time, history would be rewritten. It was a perspective change that had to happen. What looked like ultimate defeat would end up becoming history's greatest victory. Jesus turns failure to triumph. He gives beauty for ashes, gladness for mourning, hope for despair. And my challenge to you today is, what if you bookend your days with thanksgiving? Maybe you'll hit 100 blessings in a day. Last week we hit on this discipline of fasting, and what fasting does is it helps us cultivate a mindset where we're saying more yes to the Spirit and more no to the flesh. And today we're talking about gratitude. It's another way that we become made new. What if you started keeping a gratitude journal in 2020? Writing down the blessings of God in your life. Because here's the thing, when you write something down, you can go back to it. I think we need to be reminded. We forget way too easily. The reason that God had the Israelites build altars throughout the Old Testament was because it was a reminder. When they went back to the River Jordan and they saw the altar, it was like, man, remember what God did here. Remember the victory that he gave us. We tend to forget what we should remember, and we tend to remember those things that God wants us to forget. Writing it down gives you a chance to keep a track record of God's faithfulness in your life. In just a few moments, the worship team is going to come back up, and they're going to lead us in a song. And after that song, we're going to take communion. Communion is another reminder. Jesus said, do this in remembrance of me. It's a perspective shift, focusing on the sacrifice that Jesus laid out for us. Listen, if you're here today and you don't know what the future holds, trust in a God that does.
Hey, Pastor Kurtis here, and I want to thank you for watching the Bridges Talk from this week. If you made a decision to follow after Jesus, I want you to email us, info@bridgesnashville.com. We're going to send you some resources, and if you're here in the Nashville area, I'd love to grab coffee with you and talk about what it looks like to be a disciple of Christ. If you are also in the Nashville area, I'd like to invite you to join us on Sundays at 10 a.m. when we meet here at the Listening Room Cafe. You can find out more about Bridges on our website, bridgesnashville.com. You can learn about joining the Serve team, local missions, and just supporting through your generosity. It all makes a difference. Can't wait to see you here and hear about what God is doing in and through your life. God bless.